Welcome back to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jed Lea-Henry. And on today's show, we have Thomas Duvernay. Thomas, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's my pleasure because we're going to be talking about a recent book of yours and some very interesting research about the American-Korean conflict in 1871. And we'll get into this in a much more detail, of course, but it's one of those conflicts that has a very interesting point within history of the two countries. But I might get you to start with a question about the broader context, because, of course, this is 1871 we're talking about. If you wind back 5 years, the General Sherman heads up the river to Pyongyang and is firebombed. And, of course, this is also in a much broader context of the opening up of the region. So countries like Japan and China are being forcibly opened. So before we start, what is the broader context of this particular conflict?
Well, this particular one really had been brewing for a while in the United States before 1871, for probably a couple of years. You already mentioned a couple of the things related to it. Now, the thing with the General Sherman, of course, is that was not even that was not even really anything to do with the United States government or such. It was it was a private ship, the General Sherman, in 1866, and it was leased by a British company at that time. And basically they were privateers of a type, and ostensibly going as merchants for trade and such, but they really weren't. The crew was mainly made up of Southeast Asians, and there were very few Westerners actually in the crew. The only Americans on there was the captain and the owner of the ship. And then, of course, the company that had leased it, the British company, had a person on there too. There was a missionary and a couple of other people. But other than that, it really wasn't even in being crewed by Westerners. And its purpose was really just as a privateer. Now, and I'm just kind of concentrating on this one right now, mainly because many people often conflate the General Sherman with what happened in 1871. And there are indirect connections between the two, but there aren't really any direct connections between the two. After 1871, the General Sherman incident, as many people call it, was kind of used as a scapegoat of types for the lack of having really accomplished anything that America had really not accomplished anything in 1871. So it's not really directly related, but indirectly, yeah, there was, in 1871, everybody knew about it. And it was something people could point to and say, yeah, this happened back in 1866 and such. So anyway, excuse me. So anyway, I just wanted to make that kind of clear that there's not really anything directly related between those. Now, in a kind of a broader context, if you want to really, you'd have to actually go back even a year before the General Sherman was the end of the American Civil War. And of course, the American Civil War was a time that really depleted America's fighting forces. And so the years following the American Civil War, the United States was trying to rebuild its military muscle. And even though what happened in Korea in 1871 wasn't the first American use of military muscle outside the United States. It's probably the most well known of the early times that the United States was flexing its new military muscle. And it was something that for, as I said, a couple of years prior to 1871, there were hawks in the United States government who were pushing for the United States to do something. As you mentioned, Japan and China already were opened up to the West. And Korea was, to many Western eyes, Korea was a missing puzzle piece. And there were lots of rumors about what treasures might lie in Korea and so on and so forth. And so you had many people who wanted to try to exploit that, including the United States government was looking at what could be their stake, because of course Britain, opened up China during the Opium Wars times prior, and the United States did also open up trade and commerce and such with Japan in the mid 1850s. And so, yeah, there was this kind of a missing puzzle piece with Korea. And so there was a lot of concentration on that. The United States wanted to be the one to fill in that piece.
Well, let's fill in another piece then, which of course is, let's go to the very beginning of the story then, without the context there. It starts, it seems, in Nagasaki in May 12th, and this is where I believe the forces are assembling and then, of course, heading around the coast to Korea. So what did the forces look like in terms of numbers, so ships and personnel? So, yeah, fill in a bit of context for those people, just trying to get a mental image of what this conflict is going to look like.
Right. Well, there were 5 main ships. There were 3 wooden tall-masted ships. There was the Alaska, the Benicia, and the Colorado. Those were the 3 tall-masted ships. The Colorado was the flagship. And then plus there were 2 river gunboats. There was the Monocacy and the Palos. The Monocacy was a double-ended gunboat, and it was both the Monocacy and Palos were not very large at all, and for good reason, because they were meant to go up and down rivers. And the Palos was actually a converted tugboat. It was converted into a gunboat from a tugboat. And so you had those 5 main ships that composed this part of what was known as the United States Asiatic Squadron. There were other ships that were supposed to have joined in, but for one reason or another, usually repairs and things like that, they couldn't. Along with the 5 main ships, there were other types of ships. They had whale boats and cutters and such, which are, much smaller craft. There's probably, in terms of manpower, total probably about 1,200 or so, which was between sailors and marine contingents that were on board the ships. That's what kind of, I guess that's really is what the makeup of the forces were that were going in.
So they sail around the coast just off Incheon, I believe. And after a tricky period finding anchorage and getting set, I think they get set around May 29th, I believe. And I might get you to describe the first and the second interaction, because the first interaction, of course, is just with a scout troop, so to speak, of people coming out, of Koreans, to say hello, and it's very peaceful. And then after, I believe it's the next day, Korean officials come out to meet, and this is going to be very important in a moment. So once they get off the coast of Incheon, where exactly, I suppose I should get you to explain where this all takes place, and what happens with those early interactions with the Koreans.
Okay, well, yeah, as you mentioned, this is around the time that Korea was, or I mean, the American fleet was kind of getting settled into nearby where their anchorage was, and which their final anchorage is a place that was they named after the French name for it, which was the Boisé, Île Boisé, the Woody Island, which today Koreans call Jagyakdo. Back then the Korean name for it was Mulchido, and it's a very, very small island. It's only about 500 meters in length, and it lies between Incheon and Yeongjongdo, which of course Yeongjongdo is where the current international airport is. And it's just a really, really small island located there, which that, as I said, that became their anchorage point. Yes, as you mentioned, the Americans had unofficial contact with a lot of the curious Korean inhabitants around the area where they were anchoring. And those interactions were quite harmless. As I said, that was just mostly curiosity. And then on May 30th, there were Korean messengers, who came up to the flagship, the Colorado, to deliver a message that the following day there would be actual Korean representatives who were coming to talk with the Americans. And the Americans wanted them to know that, hey, we're just here peacefully, et cetera, et cetera. And then it was that following day, the last day of May, May 31st, that these three government officials came to visit the USS Colorado. Now, their intention was to meet with the people in charge. And now, one thing, this is just a little aside. There's a photo by Felice Beato, which shows three Korean gentlemen who are dressed in traditional clothing and such, and it says, three Korean officials, leading people to believe that those were the three, but actually, I believe that not to be true. I think they were just probably either villagers or even prisoners later on, who were just dressed up and made to look the part. And the reason I say that is because there was quite a description given of the officials when they came aboard the ship, and it was an official description that was written into the deck logs. It very, very different from the type of dress that the ones in the photo were wearing. So just a little bit of an aside there. But anyway, the officials came aboard the Colorado, and they were greeted by lower level American officials, because the lower level had to ascertain what level these Korean officials were, because the Americans really only wanted to discuss anything with somebody who was able to make decisions, which would be a first level official. And it was found out that these were like third through fifth level officials. So they were too low of a level to make any decisions on behalf of the Korean government. So because of that, they had to meet with only the secretary of the minister plenipotentiary, Frederick Lowe. So they just had to meet with his secretary to find out what it is what they wanted, and also just to let them know what their intentions were. And during that meeting, it really kind of seems like the Americans were doing most of the talking, because there really isn't too much that was said on the part of the Koreans. But the Americans were just explaining that, well, we want to send a survey party up as the Americans called it, the Salt River, which was the Ganghwa Straits, the water that separates Ganghwa Island from the mainland, which is at the northwest part of South Korea today. While they're explaining all of this, and we're being peaceful, etc. The Koreans weren't saying anything at all. They were being very quiet, and this was, I think, a very important thing, is that because there was kind of a little bit of a misunderstanding there. Now, I have had some people disagree with me on this point, and that I believe that the Americans were emboldened to go up the Ganghwa Straits because of this misunderstanding, whereas I have had some pushback, and some people are saying, well, the Americans would have gone up anyway, even if they had opposition from the Korean representatives. But however, with that said, the Koreans just continued to really say nothing, which to a Westerner might mean, well, they have no objection. But to the Koreans, it meant, well, we're not giving you permission. And unless you get permission, and not only that, it would have to be written permission, you cannot go up the river. Because even Korean fishing vessels had to have written permission to go up and down the river, because, of course, the Ganghwa Straits, it's a very militarily strategic area, being that it goes on up to the mouth of the Han River, which then would go on down into Seoul. So the Koreans really said nothing at all, and the Americans just went on. And in the end, at least according to American records, the Americans thought, well, okay, well, there's no problem here. So that's kind of the lead up to the problems.
Well, let's take us down that river then. So I believe they get about 5 kilometers up the river, and that misunderstanding immediately begins to play out, and they are shot at from both sides. And I'll get you to explain it, of course, but it's not the most substantial of damage, if in fact there's any. I think there's a couple of injuries involved, but this misunderstanding of language leads to this, which of course quickly leads to spark for war.
Yeah, yes, that's absolutely true. Yeah, the Americans, they sent up their 2 river boats, the Monocacy and Palos, along with, as I said, whaling boats and cutters, and a small force to just man the boats mainly. It was one that was meant to just go up, and they were doing soundings where they would drop lines down into the river to see the depth of the river at different points, and on their charts they would be marking off where rocks were and such. Now they actually had a chart to begin with, which was one they got from the French, because back in 1866, the same year that of the General Sherman, the French came to Korea, and the French did not have a very positive interaction with the Koreans. There was a lot of fighting at that time too. That was in one that was called the Sinmiyangyo, which was the Western disturbance of the Byungin year of 1806. But the Americans still they borrowed these charts from the French, so they had those to work off of, but they wanted to add more to it. So that's why they were going up the river and trying to take soundings so that they could mark everything for, in their minds, future interactions with Korea. And so anyway, as you mentioned, they got up the river a bit until they came to this bend in the river. And that's where everything starts going fast. You have a current that's just really quickly whipping around that bend, and it still does to this day. When you go and you visit there now, you can see how fast that current flows. And so, just as the ships are getting to that bend and to a point where they wouldn't be able to stop because the current is just really pulling them along, there was a certain point where you had Korean forces on both sides of the river. Now, and so we're looking at you had forts that were on Ganghwa Island, and you also had a fortress that is on the mainland. The one on the mainland is called Dukpojin. And at a certain point, they let loose with their batteries on the American forces. And now the Korean artillery was not very good at, in comparison to what the Americans had at that time. It was short range, what we call smooth bore. They are not rifled artillery at all or anything, just smooth bore, not aimed. They were just set on a particular point in the middle of the river, which is where they were just intended to go. And and so they just waited for the Americans to get to that point, and then they fired. And well, by all accounts, the Americans were quite surprised when they were fired upon, and then they were pulled around the point, which is a place that's called Yeongdudondae, the Dragon's Head. And so they were pulled around that, and then they had to turn around. But when they were north of that point, they did fire the small artillery that they had on their ships, mostly small artillery. And they were just kind of aiming just where they happened to see where they had been fired upon. Probably by that time, the Koreans who had been manning their little pieces were probably long gone. I think it was just with them. It was a fire and forget. Because they didn't have time to reload or anything. So I think they just kind of took off. And then the Americans turned around, and then as they were going back down the river, they were also some other areas were also firing on them, and they in turn returned that fire. And as you mentioned, there was minor damage that the Americans had inflicted. The Monocacy had bumped into a submerged rock, which put a small hole in its side. Nothing major, but it was enough that they had to try to do a small repair to it and such. And there were a couple of sailors who did have injuries. One lost a couple fingers with the recoil of their boat howitzer, and some other minor things, of a minor gunshot wound and such, because as I said, what the Koreans had really wasn't enough to inflict any real damage on these ships, but still, it really showed the Americans that, well, things aren't really going to be so peaceful. And so the commanders of this survey party, they decided they better go back to the anchorage and await further orders.
And importantly, how the Americans interpret this is very, very relevant here, because it's not interpreted as a misunderstanding of some sort. It's interpreted, through your work here, it's interpreted as an act of treachery, as something deliberate that they were pulled into. And it seems afterwards that the Americans give the Koreans a 10-day window to respond, and to what they seem to really want here is an apology and an explanation of sorts. But that 10-day window is going to be very relevant, because at the end of the 10-day window, the tides are also up. So if they haven't got what they want at this point, this is also the prime moment for the larger ships to head down the river and attack.
Yes, that's correct. So it was one of these things that the Americans, they looked at this as having two parts to it. And you mentioned both of them. One was like, okay, well, let's give the Korean government enough time that if they want to explain to us why they did what they did, and also apologize for it, because, well, in the Americans' mind, at least officially, they were under the understanding that they were going to be allowed to go up the river untouched. And so in their minds, well, that was not adhered to. So they saw this as being, as you said, a treacherous thing. And the other thing is that they were just looking at how the tides were changing and such, and that 10 days, which would be June 10th, the tides would be much better at that point for their ships to go up the river. Again, when we say about ships, we're only talking about the two gunboats. The three wooden tall-masted ships, they always just stayed around their anchorage point. They were just kind of a base for the gunboats to return to, get resupplied, etc. So anyway, yeah, they were waiting for any reply from the Koreans, but of course there really wasn't much of one, except for just a raft being floated down the river to the Americans, which had cows, chickens, and eggs on it with a note, and and the note basically was just saying, well, you guys will be hungry on your way home, so here's some things for you to take with you, which the Americans really didn't take as an apology at all. If anything, it was probably poking them in the eye. I kind of joke about that a little bit. I said, well, this is this was the first time of Koreans trying to export their Hanu, their Korean beef. But anyway, yeah, that's where that one ended up.
And eventually, so let's go to the conflict itself, of course, because as you say, the response isn't forthcoming. So the Americans decide to move up the river with the gunboats. So after supplying, they move up the river, and they seem to go, as you mentioned, those forts. They seem to go fort to fort, and just laying waste, it seems, to the forts. I'll get you to fill in the details here, but the Koreans seem to be horribly outgunned, and it's just inevitable that before the troops land, just when everyone is still just on the ships, it seems like this is a fairly futile act, that one side is inevitably going to win this.
And it was. Now, and this is one thing that I often try to point out to people, is that When you are comparing the American troops, which, by the way, and this is another little aside here, the American forces, 40% of them were actually from other countries. So, you know, you almost have to put Americans in quotation marks at this point. It was more like a United Nations force under the United States. Anyway, these American forces, they were in the two gunboats as they're heading up, and the accompanying boats as they were heading up the river. They were basically looking for any fortress that might fire on them on the way up. And they came to the first fortress, which was on their port side, the left side. They saw a bit of a fortification on this minor island just south of Gyeongsan Island, which the French had previously called Louise Island. It's the Korean island of Gyeongsan Island. And it's nowadays, if you go there, it's not even really an island. It's been all connected and such to Gyeongsan Island. So it's really now part of that, but still, the Americans, they threw a few of their shells into the fortification on there, but it didn't seem like anybody was home. And so they continued up. And then at this point is when they start getting to the main fortresses that they already had some interaction with. And the first one is the Choji Fortress. Now, I'm saying this just kind of in a singular type term, but actually there were two forts. There was the Choji Donde. Now, a donde is kind of a redoubt. And as a matter of fact, the Americans even called it. The Americans named it Marine Redoubt later on. And it's just a very minor fort, which is attached to another type of a fort, which is, in this case, they had one called a jin. There's a thing in Korean which they call jinbo. Jinbo are the upper level fortresses, and that means that they're going to have a major officer who's in charge. So, like equal to a Western rank of, you know, like some high colonel or general would be in charge of a jin or a bo. And Koreans just put the term together, jinbo. And whereas a donde would have a lower ranking officer in charge, but a donde always is connected to a jin or a bo. So they're always in connection with each other. Now, today, if you go to visit Choji, they call it Choji Jin. However, in actuality, Choji Jin no longer exists. What you're actually visiting is the Choji Donde, the lesser of the fortresses. The actual Choji Jin was destroyed in the, probably starting at least during the 1871 action and finished somewhere else. Now if you go to where Choji Jin once existed is now a restaurant, just kind of right next door to the Choji Donde. So anyway, the Americans get to this first one, and that is what they are concentrating on. Now, this is June 10th of 1871, and this is in the early morning. And so they are the ships are going up to fire upon all of these different fortresses and such with the armament that they have on their gunboats, because they do have some larger artillery on the gunboats. Like they had For instance, they had what would be a 60-pounder Parrott rifle, which is it's a fairly large cannon. And also they had some 9-inch shell guns, which were also large cannons. And those can really bring down not only people, but even walls of fortresses. So they would be going up the river to fire on all of these different forts with their guns, because they just, like they even do to this day in the military, you soften your targets with artillery. And then the Americans were going to methodically go from fortress to fortress to fortress. And so starting with the Choji fortresses, they tried landing in the morning on June 10th. But they ran into one very, very big problem, which was the mud flats. The mud that is off the coast of Ganghwa Island it's very deep, it's very thick, and the suction in it is just something else. Many years ago, probably about a decade ago, I was there. Actually, even before a decade ago, I was there with professors from the Korea Military Academy. Matter of fact, a couple decades ago, if I think about it, boy, I tell you, nowadays time gets so compressed. But anyway, I was there with professors from the Korea Military Academy, and we were going to try to do some searching on the mudflats just off the coast from the Choji Fortress, because there had been the reports that the Americans had tossed into the river a lot of the small bronze cannon called Bulangipo. And so we were going in there with metal detectors and waders. We had on these waist-high rubber waders and boots and everything. We were going in there to see whether or not if we could detect anything. But we had the mud. We sank in the mud this all the way up to our waist, and the suction, it was horrendous. I fell over backwards once, and it took some guys quite a time to get me back up again. We didn't stay in very long because it was just really hard to get through. And anyway, here you have a landing force of about 600 men, sailors and Marines, getting up on land with all of their supplies. They had 7 boat howitzers that they had to take with them, and so on like that. And they had to try to get all of this through this very deep and sucking mud. And just for the little bit of time I was in there, I can just see their problem. And it took them hours to get their troops and supplies ashore. And so by that time, it was late afternoon. By the time everybody had landed, I can just only imagine that there must have been some Korean scouts who were probably watching all of this and probably laughing themselves silly. But anyway, one other thing I'll mention is that when people go to visit the Choji Fortress, especially nowadays, they're probably going to have one very big misunderstanding about where the landing happened. And that is because where the Americans actually originally landed is now reclaimed farmland in back of the fortress. So when you're at the fortress, there's a excuse me, there's a road, a highway actually that goes between the fortress and farmland. Well, that farmland across the street, that was actually the mud flats that the Americans had to trudge up to get to the shoreline. And it's some hundreds of meters of it. So it was, it was not a small thing to do. So anyway, the Americans landed. They set up a camp, which is just up on shore and back of probably a couple hundred meters away from the fortress, which is where they were planning to just spend the night there that night. And they tried doing some damage to the fort while they were there that day, but it was getting too late at that time, so they just decided they were going to wait until the next day. So anyway, I'll see whatever questions you have at this point. I'll kind of leave. That's day one.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean App Podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast and you listen regularly and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below or by sharing, liking or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. So, and as people listening, this is often called the weekend war. It is, I believe, only runs for 3 days. So they've settled down for the night and they've slept through. And I believe there is a midnight attack by the Koreans, but it's very brief and very quickly repelled. But I think importantly now, a lot happens on this second day, and it seems that the Marines wake up quite early and they begin moving to destroy these two forts, Dokjin and Dokpo, at the same time covered and by their gunboats that are shelling the forts from the other side. So in a long day of fighting here, I might get you to explain what the scene looks like as an overview and what it's like, because it seems like, again, we've spoken about the armory of the ships and the forts, but in this regard, it also seems that the Koreans are horribly outmatched in terms of firepower as well.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, as you mentioned, and I'll just briefly touch on it. Yeah, the night before, Koreans did try to attack. Or at least they made sounds like they were doing so. The Americans used their boat howitzers, which they had now on. They had them on iron wheeled carriages that they could haul around, and they threw some shells in the general area of where the screams of the Korean troops were and such, and as records say, the things then became quiet. The Marines that night had been sent as skirmishers and such, and they also set up what's known as a picket line. So they're kind of like the alarm for the main force, and they set up on this one hill, which is kind of an oval shaped hill. It's still there. And ironically, maybe in a way, if you go up there, it has foxholes in it, which the Korean Marines use now for training and such. But anyway, the Marines were stretched out there, and then earlier in the next morning, the Marines were starting out, and then the sailors who were back at the U.S. camp, they finished knocking down the walls as best they could. I guess, on the Choji fortresses and burning the stores that were there and such. And then they started their line of march towards the next fortress, which was the Deokjin fortress. And today, if you go up to that area, there's a intersection, and right around where the intersection is today, most of the troops waited right there. There was a company of Marines went up the hill to the Deokjin fortress. Now again, they you'll hear them say Deokjin Jin. And when I was talking about the levels of fortress, well, this is actually Deokjin Pode, which is really the minor fortress, but it's connected to the Deokjin Jin. And the Marines went up to the Deokjin Pode, and there were actually there had been fires that had been burning there, and they were still warm, so the Americans knew the Koreans had been there not all that long before, but it was empty. That fortress was empty. The Korean soldiers had left, and so the Marines again burned the stores. They took the small bronze Bulangito cannon and tossed them over the side of the hill, and this is up on a very steep cliff, and so they tossed them off of there. And then there was a very famous photo that was taken of Marines lining the top of the walls of the Deokjin Donde. It was taken by the photographer Felice Beato. He took just dozens of photos while they were there, and so the Marines lined that wall, and it's one that's really quite famous. You'll see it all the time around the Gangha Island and such as a historical picture. But that fortress is really small. I mean, it's really a small fortress, and yet they had these guys lining up all around it. Anyway, there was a company or two of sailors that kind of went on ahead with some other Marines to just kind of go in the lead of the main forces to start their trek on the hills that would eventually lead them to their main objective, which was Gyeongsan is the name of the fortress that is the main fortress, but they were going to one that was called Sondomok Donde, the Sondomok fortress. So anyway, a small force is already leaving and heading that direction. And the main force is waiting for these Marines to come back down the hill to them. And then everybody at this point is now headed up to go along this ridge of hills. Now, they wanted to be up on top of the ridge, of course. It's, very important militarily to have the high ground. But of course, they're not only taking this hike themselves, but they're also having to haul along with them what they have on their back, which is, really heavy packs of their supplies, and also seven howitzers. And it, you can just kind of imagine, these 7 small artillery pieces, which are heavy, having to be hauled up a hill and then across and down a hill and then back up again. It took many, many, many men to do that. And they had to do this for all 7 of them. And now, of course, along the way, they would have a couple of howitzers stay on a hill for protection of their forces as the troops would go on by. And the Koreans are on hills that are opposite. They're across the way, a couple hundred meters minimum. So probably more like 300 to 500 meters in most cases. And they were hills that ran parallel to what the Americans were on. Now, the Koreans, as you mentioned, really did not have anything of firepower, anything like the firepower that the Americans had, because the Americans had they had this artillery. They had one of their artillery pieces the Americans had was rifled. And so it could shoot around very accurately and at a very, very relatively long distance. 6 of the pieces that the Americans had were smoothbore. There was no rifling, but still they were very powerful artillery pieces, and they could still go much further than what the Koreans could get away from. I mean, the Koreans really had to go back. They had to really stay back to not be in range of all of the artillery pieces. And what the Koreans had with them were their matchlock muskets, which really only have an effective, accurate range of 50 to 75 meters, and maybe 100 meters if you get lucky. Somebody else on the other end is unlucky. But past 100 meters, they really are not effective at all. And so the Koreans would be firing at the Americans, but really it wasn't doing any good. At the same time, anytime the Koreans tried to get closer, the Americans would use what is known as canister, which basically turns their smoothbore cannon into giant shotguns. So from about 200 to 400 meters away, canister could obliterate Korean troops. And so the Koreans became very wary of getting anywhere near the Americans' artillery. And for that reason, the Americans were probably spared any real serious attacks by the Koreans.
There's a wonderful story that plays out through all of this. And you remarkably spoke to the descendants of this man. So this is Lieutenant Hugh Mckee. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting story, not just for it tells us a lot, but it also tells us about military tactics, because a lot of what the Marines are doing here, in between all that horrible artillery shelling, is moving incredibly quickly. And there's all these notices throughout your research of this breakneck speed in which they're moving around. And with Lieutenant Mckee, he runs ahead of his group, and he has a pistol in one hand, a sword in the other, and he leaps into the enemy armaments. And it's a remarkable story. Not just it gives you a good understanding of what the conflict was like at this time, a man running forward with a pistol and a sword and literally launching himself at the Koreans. But it also is this remarkably stoic type of story that perhaps we don't hear enough about these days. And because he dies here, and as he's died, there's the personal account of another soldier who finds him, and he looks up at this other soldier that finds him, and the soldier says, he looked up at me and said in his cool, calm way, "Mac, I'm mortally wounded." And then later on, as he takes him out for hospital care, he says, "Well, goodbye, Mac, if I don't see you again." It's all very matter of fact. So I'm not here to talk about Lieutenant Mckee, and I suppose the speed of the infantry movements on the ground.
Okay, well, now of course, what you mentioned there was really kind of the climax of the entire the entire thing. I mean, that's where things really get interesting. But yeah, you're right. They didn't want to waste any time, because for one thing, numbers were against them, because there were probably, now the Americans have, I think, way overinflated the number of enemy. There were things were the Americans were estimating maybe about 5,000 Korean troops. I doubt it. There might have been a couple thousand, possibly, but probably in troops that engaged the Americans, it was probably about parity between the Americans and the Koreans troop wise. And so anyway, the Americans wanted to go as quickly as possible because they were really afraid of Koreans cutting off an escape route to their rear. And that was one reason why they left cannon on hills for a while until their troops were able to get into position elsewhere. And then that artillery would then move along to the next hill and such, and they would just keep leapfrogging until the Americans were in their final attack position. There were actually two artillery hills that the Americans used. I called one Artillery Hill 1 and Artillery Hill 2. Sadly, Artillery Hill 1 now has some people's homes on top of it, which it's really sad because I kind of call that land cancer. All that history is lost. But anyway, they had all of this artillery cover, and then the American troops went and massed on a hill that was most of the troops started massing on a hill that was west of their main objective of the Sondolmok fortress. And they kind of hid behind that. But the companies of sailors and Marines, they spread out along that whole length of hill. As a matter of fact, the Marines actually were very, very, very close to the main fortress. They were probably only 40 or 50 meters away from the main fortress. And they were trying to keep themselves hidden from view as much as possible from the Korean defenders. Now, one thing let me mention, and that is, and this is rather important because the sailors, their armament, their personal weapons, firearms, were the Remington rolling block carbines. And these were very important because they were breech loading metal cartridge firearms. They were ones that were single shot, but they could be loaded and reloaded very, very quickly. The Marines, on the other hand, had muzzle loading rifles which were from the American Civil War. They were rifled, so I mean they were able to have a lot more accuracy and range than what the Korean smoothbore muskets were. But still, they could only be loaded from the muzzle end, down the barrel, and probably only 2 or 3 shots in a minute. And so the Marines had a much more difficult time when it came to firepower, but they still made do with that. So you had the sailors with actually pretty advanced firearms for that time, and the Marines making do with what was used during the American Civil War. Anyway, all the American forces were in their positions behind the hill a little bit. The Koreans were firing at them. Now, the hill is probably about 120, 150 meters away from the main fortress. And so the Koreans are firing, but their musket balls are really not doing a lot of damage. They're mostly, by the time they get to the American side, they don't have much energy left to them at all. As a matter of fact, when I was doing some of my field research, I found many Korean musket balls that were basically on the surface of the ground. because they just didn't have the energy to go in. And they were still round. They weren't deformed or anything from hitting the ground. But anyway, the Koreans were firing. And then during this time, while the Americans are behind the hill, their artillery, both the howitzers they had with them, their field howitzers, plus the guns that were on the that were on the Monocacy. The Palos is not in action right now. The Palos had some problems of its own, so it was not able to take part. So the Monocacy had some heavier guns, and it was firing at the main fortress, and it was bringing the fortress walls down. When we look at deaths and such, the Korean side, the casualties that they had, probably the majority of those casualties were from artillery, not so much from man to man. They had airburst from these large guns, which sent huge swaths of metal at all these people. It was bringing the walls down, and it was bringing the men down. So it was something very terrible for them. But still, the Koreans, even though they had all this happening, they were still trying to fire as much as they could towards their attackers, the Americans. And the Americans would fire back at them with their arms. And then there was at a certain point, the artillery was halted. And it was at that point that the Americans were ready for their attack. Now, one thing is that already some of the American troops had made their way into the valley, which separated the hill they were hiding on and the fortress, which is at the top of another hill. So many of these troops were already in the valley, and that's the one that you were talking about, Lieutenant Mckee. Well, he would have been, he would have been in that lead company that would have made its way down into the valley. And then when the signal was given, then all of the American troops rose to attack. So you had those in the valley that were already making their way up the hill. And the hill is it's very steep. So as long as the Americans kept their heads down and basically crawled up the hill, the Koreans could not aim down that hill at them with their matchlock muskets. Not easily, at least. And not only that, but things were happening so fast that the Koreans had no chance to reload their muskets. So their muskets basically became just clubs at that point, and they were grabbing anything they could. Now, remember, the artillery had the artillery had brought down the walls. And so there's lots of rubble and everything around. And so the Koreans were taking a lot of this rubble and sticks and whatever else and tossing it down the hill at the Americans who were coming up. I mean, they were just using anything they could to try to repel the Americans. But yet the Americans kept coming up. And then you also had the forces that had been at the top of the other hill, and they're coming down in the valley, and now they're coming up the side of the hill. You have the Marines who were just maybe about 40, 50 meters away to begin with, and they had already risen, and they were heading towards the fortress. And by the way, the first American who was killed in this action, and there were 3 Americans who were killed in this action, just only 3. The first one was a Marine by the name of Dennis Hanrahan, and he actually was from Ireland, from Kilkenny, Ireland. And he actually was killed just before the main attack happened. A Korean, he was hit with a Korean musket ball, but then again, the Marines were much closer to the fortress. So that musket ball still had a lot of energy to it at that point. And then we mentioned about Hugh Mckee, and yeah, he's in that lead there. And there isn't much in the way of walls anymore. They're basically by this time mounds of dirt that separate the outside from the inside of that fortification. But yeah, according to different accounts, he had drawn his sword, so he had that in one hand. He had his revolver in the other, and he jumped over that mound that used to be a wall and into the fort. And one Korean shot him in the groin, and another one speared him in the side. And that's when he fell. And then right in back of him was another naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Schley, who later on actually he became a very famous naval officer during the time of the Spanish-American War at the end of that century. But anyway, he was following Lieutenant Mckee, and that same guy who had speared him tried to spear Schley also, but Lieutenant Commander Schley took the spear and held it against his side, and then he shot the guy who had just speared Mckee. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, later on, there was the interaction between Mckee and his best friend, who was Bloomfield McIlvaine, who was another lieutenant. That was when Mckee, he knew that was the end for him, which of course, was very, very sad and such for as that part of the story goes. And there was one other sailor. His name was Seth Allen, and he was shot multiple times actually as he tried to get over the walls into the forts. Actually, it said that he was scaling the parapet when he was actually shot. So there were 3 Americans who were outright killed. I mean, there was another one who died June 2nd, but that was from a brain inflammation, probably sunstroke, I'm going to guess, because it was very, very hot and such during that time, and many of the Americans, even during this trek, were hit with sunstroke. So that's probably what that one was at. Anyway, as the story goes, really the fighting inside the fortress was not very long, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, maybe. And it was pretty much hand-to-hand combat at that point, because, the Koreans, of course, couldn't reload or anything their matchlocks. So they had their swords and they had their fists. They were probably using their matchlocks as clubs, I'm going to guess. The Americans were pretty much doing the same thing at that point. Just the sheer number of Americans coming into the fortress just overwhelmed the Korean troops at that right then. Many of the Korean troops were trying to escape because they wanted to go in and then reform themselves someplace else. Now, anytime that the Koreans tried running away, you had American small artillery on the opposite hills and such that were watching this, and then they would fire upon those Korean troops who were trying to escape. And in the end, the only Koreans who were really left in the fortress alive were ones who were wounded and really couldn't defend themselves anymore. And there were probably only about 20 Korean troops who in the end were taken prisoner. And the Americans actually had intended that they wanted prisoners. The Americans wanted prisoners because to them, the Americans thought these would be bargaining chips. But little did they know, the Koreans were like, no. To the Koreans, like, no, these guys, they were supposed to die. They had an oath to fight to the death, and they didn't die. So the Koreans were, well, basically, well, keep them. And so they were not really any bargain for the Americans. The Americans eventually let these Korean prisoners just go, and they were arrested by the Korean authorities and interrogated, and who knows what happens for most of them after that. So in the end, that it was a very violent, exciting end, but it was really an end because the Americans really didn't get what they came there for, which was to have some kind of a relationship with Korea.
Well, let's step into that last day then. So, this, of course, this last day is, I think it's June 12th. And the Americans, after that, after conquering all these forts, after destroying them, after killing a lot of Koreans, and at least dispelling all the defensive Korean positions, they seem to just up and leave the next day. So the next day, in terms of what happens, it's simply ferrying all the materials back to those boats. And then there is a whole bunch of administrative things like inspections, and there's court martials and promotions, and a whole series of after the fact administrative things that seem to go on. But as you say, that last day, the Americans are very quick to up and leave, and they, of course, there is one particular statement that comes out of this, and I believe it's from the I think it's the United States flagship Colorado, and I think it's the commander-in-chief, and his explanation afterwards comes out, and he says, the Korean government haven't failed to make an apology for this murder. It's an attack. And he goes on to say, we were dispatched and we punished the enemy. And it seems as if that was the sole outcome for the Americans after this. It was just a type of punishment, because you go on to say in a number of details that there really wasn't much more for the Americans. Sure, they managed to punish them, but the Koreans didn't give much in anyway. And after the fact, the country that does manage to benefit the most from this is Japan eventually.
Yeah, the Americans really didn't get much out of this. It's actually one of the things that I've mentioned, and many people have said afterwards, is that the Americans won militarily, but they lost diplomatically. And this is why you'll hear Koreans say that they won this war. To the Koreans, they did because they never gave in to the Americans diplomatically. The Americans stayed in Korean waters until July 3rd. So they were there a good long time after the battles were done, and they did that purposely because they didn't want to just leave, because that would look like the Koreans kicked them out. So they wanted to stay around a little bit so that, they could show that, well, we'll leave when we're ready to leave. And they actually did this for a very practical reason, because at the same time this is going on, in China, there were anti-foreigner uprisings that were going on. And the Americans didn't want to give any kind of a look like foreigners can be kicked out if you put your mind to it. So they didn't want to give any kind of help to the anti-foreigner interests in China, because word gets to China very quickly. So they wanted it to be that no, the Americans still are here. They're still here. Now we're not fighting with them, but they're still in our waters. And then the Americans left. And and during this time they had to find things to do, as it goes in with any naval force. And so they just went about their their usual duties. They did have one interesting thing happen there. One of their small boats had sunk, and so they spent quite a few days trying to get it raised. And that was, they had guys in diving suits who had to go down and try to do that stuff. So, and these things were, it was probably, not only a practical thing to do, but it was it probably, kind of kept the men interested a little bit on, well, what's going on now? You know, there's a little bit of drama for them because, with sailors and such, idle hands, you know, can get into a lot of trouble. So that's why they were always kept working and doing this. And yeah, a lot of them did get into trouble still. And so there were a lot of punishments that were going on during that time and such. But eventually, yeah, they sailed off to China. And when they arrived in China, it was July 4th, which of course is the American Independence Day. And at that point, you know, it was, you know, just 75 years, you know, that would have been the 75th anniversary of independence. So when they sailed into China, there were festivities that were going on there for that. Now, one thing that you mentioned, and it is correct. Yeah, this really kind of opened the door for Japan, because it was only just a handful of years later that Japan came also to Ganghwa Island, and they were much more successful. And there were reasons for that. One, and probably one of the best reasons that they had for being more successful, is timing. When the Americans came into Korea in 1871, the person in charge at the time was the regent of Korea, the Daewongun. And he is the father of the king who became King Gojong. Gojong at that time was still under the age of majority, so he still had not actually taken the throne in full. He was nominally the king, but his father, the Daewongun, really controlled the country. And the Daewongun, he was very anti-foreigner. And but he had good reason. I mean, when you think about it, he had, especially the incidents that happened in 1866 with the French and also the General Sherman, and then a year later had a German adventurer who came in with a group of men and tried to dig up his father's tomb to hold for ransom. And so he was necessarily very disgusted with other countries. He wanted really nothing to do with other countries, especially Western countries. However, King Gojong came to power in 1873 when he reached majority. And at that point, actually, the Daewongun was pretty much completely out of power. And he even, as things went on over the years, you know, he went into exile, etc. But Gojong was, he tended to be a lot more open-minded about things. And when the Japanese came in late 1875, there really was not anything to resist them like there was in 1871. And so the Japanese, they just had very, very good timing, I think, at that point. Now, of course, it was kind of a convoluted thing that the Japanese used to pressure the Koreans into capitulating to them, but they did, and so that was the first real opening of Korea to other countries. And then a few years after that, the Americans came, and they were the first Western country to sign a very unequal treaty with Korea. And then right upon the heels of that, other Western countries immediately did so also. And, really kind of as they say, the rest is history.
Well, that is also a great note to leave the podcast on, despite being painfully aware of how much in your book we didn't manage to get to here, or we had to move over so quickly. So I'm going to link your book below the podcast, and I really do encourage listeners to go and have a look for it themselves. A lot more detail there, and you really will not be disappointed. Thomas Duvernay, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Well, thank you. But I would like to mention one other thing, and that is as of this date right now, very soon I will have a print version of the book that is coming out. So that is one that people can also be looking forward to. Those who don't like to read ebooks, those who like to have actual paper books to read, it'll be coming out very soon.
Well, again, I will link the ebook below, and anyone that, of course, like myself, who prefers the written format, keep their eyes out for the next one. Thanks again, Thomas.
Thank you very much. It was really good talking with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Career Now podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.